Ladies and gentlemen, do welcome to the next episode of my Safe Bet show. And it's a great privilege and gives me a pleasure to welcome Mr. GlynWilliams, Chief of Staff at the Ontario Lottery and Gaming Corporation, as the guest. So, Aaron, thank you very much for coming on. It's great to have you.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me, Martin. I've followed the show and I'm happy to be invited as a guest.
We have a fan on the show, so that should help. Fantastic. I tend to, because you might know this, because you've been kindly following the show, I tend to kick it up with rather light-hearted questions. Then we'll go through what hopefully won't turn out to be the hard questions. And then we'll wrap it up by talking about sports. GlynWilliams, that caught my eye. So the name Glyn, unless I got it horribly wrong, if I did, then I, of course, apologize, has Welsh origins, or perhaps possibly maybe hailing from Irish Gaelic. And then, of course, the name William or Williams, then that spreads across the British Islands, even Normandy and what have you. So that's the question, is that where your family originally comes from? And could you give us a bit of a potted history of your family moving over to Canada?
Well, it's actually a very interesting question, Martin, because GlynWilliams does have a Welsh background and the name is of Welsh origins. But I got that name from my father's side of the family, which are actually Guyanese, and they're West Indian from Guyana.
Oh, right.
I'm of mixed race background, and what we assume to be the case is that when my ancestors were brought to the British colony of Guyana to, I assume, enter into some kind of indentured servitude, they were given a Welsh name, and the family has kept it to this day. But we do not have any Welsh background in our bloodline or in our ancestry, despite the extremely Welsh name.
That's even more interesting than I thought it would be. And also, this is a proof that we're not rehearsing these shows. In the similar vein, before we move on to talk about your illustrious career, are there any notable ancestors of yours you'd like to give a shout out to right now?
Not beyond my immediate family. You know, I've never done that ancestry check or done any of that following. I get a little worried about handing over my DNA to a private company for purpose of retracing my family background. So other than those family members that I'm aware of, I was told once that some distant family members in Guyana are very famous cricket players. So I've never visited Guyana, but I was told that if I were to, some people would recognize my name from an illustrious line of cricket players, but I have not verified that fact.
That's a very cool claim to fame. And cricket has already come up as well, but I shall digress a bit. But I suppose in terms of your personal data privacy, DNA, as a man who's been mainly working with government bodies, perhaps the government could help you out with that. You wouldn't need to share anything with the private sector. Anyway, as I've said, I would hate to go off tangent. So moving on to the next question, and we'll be talking about the Toronto transport system, including the Pearson airport. So throughout your career, besides quite a few other things, what has yet again caught my eye when reading your resume was indeed the fact that you used to work with the Pearson airport as well as the Crosslinks transit solutions. And I have had the privilege and pleasure, and I do, to travel to the beautiful city of Toronto quite often. And I've become a fan of the Pearson airport, but this love or infatuation doesn't seem to be shared by too many Torontonians. So why do you think that would be? Why do you think that poor Pearson Airport may not be enjoying the best of reputations?
Yeah, I mean, I would imagine everyone's experience is subjected subjective to what they were treated to when they traveled through the airport. And certainly, as many airports during the pandemic and the restrictions on travel and then the reopening, there were some really awful horror stories at that airport of like very long lines and baggage challenges. I think Torontonians love to complain about the things they have. And I think sometimes that doesn't always come with a good understanding of what it's like in other places. I've had the privilege to do a fair amount of travel, and I quite like Pearson Airport. I think it works quite efficiently in the most part. It's amenity rich. I enjoy the time traveling through there, despite the security snarls. If I were still being a good lobbyist for the airport, I would tell you that the border security, the lines you go through to get through security, are not staffed by employees of the corporation that runs the airport. Those are federal employees. And there's been a lot of back and forth over the years of the airport advocating for more agents to be put on to reduce those security screening timelines. So as is often the case in Canada, there's usually a dynamic of many different agencies, some governmental, trying to coordinate and collaborate, and that can lead to some opportunities for increasing efficiency.
See, I already sense a bit of rivalry between provincial and federal authorities. Hopefully, no, or at least not too much bad blood. But you know what I would pick up on, and then let's get a bit more serious. You said that Torontonians, they might not be the only people on this planet for obvious reasons, but that they love to complain. So on your laundry list of complaints, would you throw anything else in the mix, just out of curiosity? Because I'm sure that other Canadians or even Torontonians will be eagerly watching this episode of the Safe Bet Show.
I think this city has a lot of really great things to offer and can be a wonderful place to live. But, you know, we would have what are probably some familiar gripes around the exorbitant cost of housing and the unreasonable traffic that we all sit through on any given day. We are in the height of what we call construction season here in the summer months, where it seems that they just choose to dig up every road at the exact same time. And we see restrictions on lanes that don't always make sense to those driving through them. And that is certainly cause for frequent complaints amongst Torontonians, is the traffic situation and the cost of housing. But other than that, it's a beautiful place. We're also in summer festival season. I don't want to give your viewers the idea that it's not a wonderful place to live in or visit, because I've been here my whole life. I certainly think it is.
It absolutely is. And indeed, you've been a great advocate for it. And we share that profession of government or community relations, or if you will, I'm going to use what some may perceive as a rather horrible, if not awful word, lobbyist. But I think there's a lot of pride in that. So now moving on to the serious parts of the podcast, as you said yourself, you've done a lot of lobbying work for all things transport in Toronto and Ontario. So could you draw any ideally interesting or exciting similarities that your previous roles would have had with your current role that we will come on to in a second? Or in other words, what lessons did you learn and what lessons can you be both juxtaposing and applying to the gambling industry?
Yeah, I think, and I consider that question. One common thread that I've seen through my career experiences, even though they've been in varied industries, has been that they've been on significant projects, usually led by government, that require a fairly large transformation, and where we're trying to ensure that benefits are getting to the community that the project is intended for. So when you look at my experience with transit projects, it was around ensuring that we had local employment, training opportunities for residents that lived around those projects, and that the money that we were spending to build it really benefited the communities that it was happening in, and where the disruptions were taking place. And that similar vein has followed me through my career, where I get engaged and I get excited on projects where there's a lot of transformation happening around it, and you're trying to ensure that it benefits the community in the way that it's intended. And as your viewers may know, and certainly we know here in Ontario, the gaming industry has has gone through a very significant period of transformation over the past few years. Increased availability, opening up of the market, new casino operations, really on every measure. We've seen significant transformation. And these always were done with the intention of improving revenues to government, making things, having a more regulated, safer industry for players and for the community. And so I'm forgetting the word right now, but that a combination of the transformation needing to benefit the communities that it's happening in is something that I've carried in my career, and that attracted me to the gaming industry when I joined just over 3 years ago.
And we're glad to have you. And indeed, I can't agree more. The only constant of this industry is the state of flux, which I suppose keeps us entertained. Let's talk OLG, organization that I dare say needs no introduction. You were originally brought in as its director for policy research and strategy. And as we said, as part of the introduction, you're now the chief of staff. For, I suppose, the very few that may not know what the purpose and mission of the Ontario Lottery and Gaming Corporation might be. It's in the clues in the name, but still, would you mind giving us your perspective on that and how your role fits into it all?
Well, Ontario Lottery and Gaming was created by an act of the government. It is an agency that exists to conduct and manage gaming activities, lottery schemes in the province of Ontario, and to ensure that a dividend is returned to the government in order to fund all of the social programs and government investments that are important to building strong communities. And that has been OLG's mandate throughout its existence. We're coming up to our 50th anniversary of OLG existing. But as you said in your preamble to the question, it's been an organization that's also been in a constant state of flux. It started with just a few lottery schemes. It then opened up to casino operations. There was a period of time when the OLG was actually operating each of the casinos in Ontario. There was a modernization that brought private sector partners into Ontario to operate those casinos through a contract with the OLG. And we also operate our own iGaming platform, which is a competitor in the open environment that we have here in Ontario. So it is a dynamic place where there are a number of different lines of business that touch lottery, land-based gaming, and iGaming. And OLG's role in conducting and managing the gaming activities in each of those business lines is slightly different. And it means that it's a very dynamic and interesting place to work.
Certainly a lot to do from the sound of it. So this is always a tricky question, I appreciate, but to the extent you are allowed to tell us and reveal any key projects you guys have in the pipeline, or I suppose, do you also continue working on your own 2022-25 responsible gambling plan? So what's lying ahead of OLG right now?
Well, because OLG's purpose is to do good for Ontario, to generate a dividend to the government of Ontario, to support and build our communities, we exist as a nonprofit corporation. 100% of our proceeds and every dollar that is played through OLG is invested back into Ontario. And with that mission comes a real priority to make sure that we're doing that in a way that doesn't further social harms or create unintended consequences in the communities that we exist to serve. So that's where the responsible gambling program comes in and our ambitions there. And I'm sure we'll talk more about that in a second. As a corporation and as a business, we're facing some unique challenges and opportunities, as I'm sure are familiar to others in the gaming industry. On our lottery line of business, we are looking and working diligently on increasing the points of sale. Consumer behavior is changing. People don't go into the gas station anymore. They're either charging their electric vehicle or they're paying at the pump. When you're at the grocery store, you're using the self-checkout lane. So those points of sale, 10,000 of which are in Ontario and OLG's network, we're seeing consumer behavior change, and we need to broaden our points of sale to respond to those consumer behavior changes. So we've started launching self-serve terminals, integrating technology into self-checkout, and that will certainly be a focus for the organization in the years to come. come is just keeping up with consumer behavior and making sure that they can access our products in the ways that they do their other shopping and run their errands. We've made real investments in the casino gaming environment with those private sector partners that I mentioned. We've got $1.5 billion was recently invested by Great Canadian Entertainment at the Great Canadian Casino Resort Toronto, which is in the northwest of the city. And we are also doing the same in the Ottawa region, working with Hard Rock. There's some significant investments there. So what we're doing is investing in those facilities to make them amenity rich, really appeal to that reopening since the pandemic on bringing visitors back, and not just to game, but to access the other amenities like concerts and restaurants and hotels are being added there. And then in iGaming, I think that needs little, I would hope that needs little introduction for your viewers. This has been a place where OLG has started to compete with nearly 50 other licensed operators that iGaming Ontario has brought into the Ontario market. And that's required us to really up our game on a good customer experience, on a really seamlessly integrated responsible gambling program. So underpinning all of that business growth and those really important strategic priorities is making sure that we're doing it in a way that benefits communities and doesn't harm them. And that's where our responsible gambling plan and commitment comes in, is making sure that that's at the core of our business. We've been award winners in responsible gambling for over 20 years. We were the first jurisdiction in Ontario to bring in a self-exclusion program. We are the only jurisdiction the first in Canada. We're the only jurisdiction in Canada that uses facial recognition to support our players in their participation in that self-exclusion program. And that's just one example of where we've been leaders in the space. When we launched our iGaming platform back in 2015, we had player risk monitoring and analytics built right in from the start, which is something we see now a bit of catch-up happening in the market. So in order for us to really generate that dividend for government and invest in Ontario, we have to make sure that our business operations are taking care of our players and doing it in a responsible way. And that's where the responsible gambling plan comes in, and where I cut my teeth, as you'd say, in the organization and in coming on and leading that work.
And started beating us to all those awards. So congratulations again. Yeah, we happened to compete on a source of
I
France,
see a few behind you too, so I think you're doing just fine. Yeah.
But we're still friends, not only for the purposes of this podcast. Let's briefly talk the iGaming regulation. And there's a theme to this. I'm a fan of the Pearson Airport. I'm a big fan. That's a matter of public record of the Ontario regulation. The Leafs, as a Bruins fan, will come on to that. It's a bit of a love and hate. But talking about and focusing on the Ontario regulation for a second, at least in my book, it has established itself as one of the world leading ones. So if you had your crystal ball and did some glazing, where do you believe that regulation is currently headed in the next year or two, or even beyond?
Well, I think the AGCO has done, the Alcohol and Gaming Commission of Ontario, which is our regulator here in Ontario, has done an exemplary job in regulating the market in a way that has made it open to competition, transparent and fair for all operating, but also has really made some important requirements around responsible gambling, responsible marketing, and advertising. And so we have a very strong model here in Ontario that's brought I don't know the last time I checked the number, but I think it was at 51 last time. I think that's certainly going to be something we see over the next couple of years, is potentially some consolidation of the market. We have a lot of players in the Ontario market. A lot came in. I think as we start going off of acquiring new players and it starts being more about really serving and providing the best experience to the players that you have and competing in a tighter market, we may see some exits from the market and consolidations. We saw a very notable one in the past year from Kindred exiting the Canadian market. And I think that iGaming Ontario, in leading the licensing aspect of the market, and the AGCO on the regulatory side of things is going to take an approach to manage and maintain the environment that they've been successful in creating. Certainly advertising has been very top of mind for Ontarians and Canadians. With this expansion of the market has become a very big expansion in the advertising that Canadians have seen. And we've started to see some initial changes from the AGCO around the use of athletes, one behind me, in gambling advertising.
We'll talk about him. Don't worry.
And rolling, rolling some of those back, making sure that we're not using athletes in ways that promote gaming, but we're using them around our responsible gambling priorities. So I think that's what you'll see. On the industry side, you'll see consolidations, maybe a few exits of the market, really a focus on those that have been successful in providing good experiences and keeping loyal players will remain. You'll see our regulatory environment take a maintenance approach and making some changes around the edges to make sure that this is a responsible and safe environment for Ontarians to play in. And one of the things that's driving us all to, just to come back to my earlier question, is to really up our game in RG. It's not good enough anymore to just provide some supports for your players and hope that they know where to find them, hope that they know where to find those limit setting tools, and that they do that on their own. There is now a responsibility on operators here to monitor players for risk when they see players playing in ways that show signs of gambling harm and risk, to intervene accordingly, to provide tailored supports at the right time for those players, to make sure that we're providing a safe environment. And that's the type of thing you would know very well is not easy to do, requires continuous improvement, requires collaboration. And so I think that'll be another key focus, certainly for OLG and for other operators in Ontario, is making sure that we're investing in our RG programs and we're supporting our players in the right way.
In the same spirit, do you believe, because Ontario, I can't agree more, has established, or for years even, has been one of the leaders when it comes to all things RG, do you think that model is exportable, including to the likes of the US?
Well, the interesting thing about the gaming industry broadly, and RG being no different, is it's globalized, right? It's very international, especially when you see big companies like Entain who have operations in a number of jurisdictions, where there are aspects of their operations that work or provide support to players in one place, and then they migrate into another jurisdiction. So Ontario certainly has been a leading jurisdiction in a number of ways, but frankly, over the past couple of years has been importing and taking a lot of leadership lessons from what's been happening in European jurisdictions, what's been happening with the UK Gambling Commission and the Act Review, what I talked about just previously around monitoring and intervening appropriately. A lot of the leadership that we see there is coming out of European jurisdictions, where we've got some lessons to learn about serving up those right interventions at the right time. And I think that our friends down south will certainly benefit from learning some of these lessons about monitoring your players and making sure that you've got supportive and effective messages. This isn't about restricting people or wagging your finger at them, but at the right point in the play experience, making sure that you're providing the type of advice and support that would help a player have a better outcome. And, that's not easy to do. That's something where Ontario takes leadership from international jurisdictions, and the U.S. jurisdictions, I'm sure, will watch with interest what's happening in Ontario, as they would in others as well.
Always a matter of perspective, isn't it? Not only geographical, but also cultural. Wagging fingers, the First Amendment rights. But let's not get too Trumpian on this podcast. Talking about other places in Canada itself, I totally appreciate that OLG's remit is within Ontario, but I strongly believe that you and your team and the whole organization would be keeping a keen eye on what's been happening elsewhere. So let's talk Alberta. What's your view on the anticipated regulatory developments in Alberta?
Well, I think that the province of Alberta and the citizens of Alberta are going to be able to make the right decisions for themselves, and it looks as though they're on that path, and they're looking for some inspiration from the Ontario market that I'm sure will get carried over, as well as some adjustments for what works well in their jurisdiction. We are a confederation, after all, here in Canada, and I know a lot of viewers might be familiar with states' rights in the United States, but certainly provincial areas of jurisdiction and the independence of provinces in those areas is very important to us in Canada as well. So Alberta will do what is right for them. But I think what we've shown in Ontario and to a certain extent, OLG had to really grow and adapt to it, is that opening up the market does channelize players out of the gray and black market sites and into licensed and regulated sites where a dividend can be provided to government and a safer regulated experience can be provided to players. And so I'm sure and I know that that's Alberta's focus, is to open up the market to achieve those same goals, and some of the success in Ontario can certainly be informative to them as they do that.
I'm truly enjoying this lobbyist to lobbyist conversation, by the way. Hopefully the same goes for you, Aaron. And so we now landed firmly in what in the US would be the 10th Amendment territory, or in geographical terms, to stick to that, the other side of the mountains. I'm sure that they will draw quite some inspiration from what you guys have done and achieved in Ontario. We are now nearly hitting the home straight of this podcast, but we still have 2 topics, and then I will give Aaron 60 seconds to convey his key messages. DEI activities. Canada's a very diverse jurisdiction, and you've been very heavily involved with the likes of Pride, Toronto, the Civic Action, most recently with the NIA Centre for Arts. So the Black Arts Centre that you've helped launched in Oakwood Village, unless I got that one wrong, that caught my eye on your resume as well. All very commendable. So I'm sure that there will be parts of the audience of this podcast that would love to hear more about that particular project. So that's my next question.
Well, I don't think that diversity, cultural diversity, and having citizens from around the world living and working and playing together in one city is something that's unique to Canada, unique to Ontario, unique to Toronto. But it certainly is something that plays a very important role in our city. The multicultural fabric of the city is strong. I don't want to start quoting facts and being incorrect about it, but a plurality of our citizens are coming from different countries. And I think one of the unique things in Toronto is that they come from everywhere. We see some cities where a large part of the immigrant community, those that are coming from elsewhere, are hailing from one particular region or one particular country. And what's been, I think, unique in Toronto's context is they've really come from around the world. And that means that we've got some of the best food that you'll find anywhere. We've got some of the best cultural events that you'll find out anywhere. And our citizens live and breathe working together. This kind of diversity and inclusion is something that is core to who we are. And any company that wants to operate in the Ontario market, any government project that wants to be successful in Ontario, is going to need to integrate that equity, inclusion principles, making sure that you're reflecting of the community that you serve right at the core of it, because it's what we expect. It's not really like a hot issue to talk about anymore. It's just kind of table stakes. And I've been fortunate to be involved in a couple of examples. You listed projects where we really celebrate that inclusion, that diversity here, really highlighting what that brings to a community and how much richer a community is when it's got a diversity of perspectives around the table. But in our context of the gaming industry, that's the player of the future. The ability of the gaming industry to continue to grow by appealing primarily to a white male customer base is done. I don't know how more eloquently to say that. And if we want to see continued growth in our industry, then it does mean making sure that we've got the right cultural relevance. We talked about cricket at the beginning of the podcast in terms of that being one of the fastest growing sports here in the Toronto market. I know we'll get to some that your viewers might be more familiar with, but Canada, Ontario is increasingly a cricket and a soccer playing country, and that's because our citizens are changing and coming from around the world. So I live it. I am from a mixed race background. I have family from very different parts of the world, and I'm born and raised in Toronto. This is part of who I am, and I think it's part of what Ontario is and the strength of the community. And I've been lucky to play a small role in celebrating that. And I think it's an important lesson for the gaming industry to heed and to stay on top of, because if you continue to appeal to just one element of your player base, you will eventually disappear.
You couldn't put it more eloquently. And well done to Canada at the recent Copa America. I also got to say, as yet another sidebar, that last time I was up in Toronto, I had probably the best Greek food I've ever had. Even much better than any Greek food I would have had in Greece, with all due respect to Greece. Let's move on to the man right behind you, Mr. John Tavares, who, at least for now, is still serving as the Leafs captain. I'll try to behave and try, will be hard, to suppress my Boston Bruins instincts. I will not ask whether this year is the year the next season. It's the season when the Leafs finally, after nearly 60 years, get to hoist the cup. I will already ask about the general prospects under Coach Berube and how will the by now fabulous, famous and phenomenal four of the Leafs, including Tavares, do next season, in your view?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very interesting to hear your run through of it. Certainly, we have a strong franchise and a strong team and a lot of hope in Coach Berube to really up the game of the Leafs. It tends to be in those playoff rounds where we see our team start to suffer. But I got to say that personally, I'm far more of a tennis, soccer, F1 fan than I am a hockey fan. That speaks to the diversity of the city I live in that we were just talking about. Those are the sports that I tend to follow more closely. So I would defer to other colleagues that I talk to on their expert view in terms of where the Leafs are going. But I think that we've always had a strong franchise here. It's well resourced. Coach Berube having won Stanley Cup with St. Louis and now coming here, we've got a lot of hope for what the seasons ahead have to bring. And we wouldn't say that about all of our teams. I noticed you're not going to talk about the Blue Jays, which is where, maybe there's a little bit more concern over the medium to long term, but a lot of hope in the Leafs.
As I've said, I'm trying to be kind. 2 points before I give Aaron yet another opportunity to shine and even more firmly cement his future place in the Gaming Hall of Fame. First of all, damn Pasternak in Game 7. And secondly, you might need to get Coach Berube to talk to those Blue Jays and the likes of Lance Stroll. He might need a bit of a hard dressing.
I said I was an F1 fan. I didn't say I was a fan of the Canadian F1 driver. Important distinction there.
I'm trying to keep it topical. Anyway, good sir. 60 seconds for you to convey your key messages, be them about all the great stuff you have done in the diversity space, the gambling industry, or even Formula One.
I think that the common thread in our conversation, Martin, has been about the players that this industry is existing to entertain and serve and generate a profit or a dividend from, as the case may be. And in order to do that, you really have to understand who your players are. That's where the diversity, the cultural relevance, and the inclusion comes in. We are talking to an increasingly diverse and dynamic player base, and the need for operations and game offerings and and marketing to respond to that is going to be critical for success. When you talk about valuing your players and making sure that they have good experiences, it's really important to embed RG as part of that. It is so easy and incorrect to look at RG as a compliance activity, a restriction on play, or something that reduces your competitiveness. Those days are long since past, and I would encourage any who still see it that way to familiarize themselves and to try things where responsible gambling messages, incentives, the right supports that your employees have can add to a really good player experience. It can make it better for players. It can make your player base more loyal. It increases sustainability. It reduces your player churn. It's got a lot of those benefits. I know it's easy to talk about silver bullets, and when people get passionate about an area, they're like, it'll solve all your problems. But leaning in to your responsible gambling program is a really important way to improve your player experience and to improve the sustainability of your business. And we are focused on that heavily at OLG. That'll certainly be an important business priority to come. Because we've been leaders in the space previously, doesn't mean we're going to rest on our laurels. It means we're going to keep investing and improving and supporting our players in the right way, while also making sure that we've got the right game offerings and the really good and entertaining experience that we know that they come to expect. So really putting your player at the center of your decisions and what drives you day to day is what we're doing here at OLG. And if you give me an opportunity for a key message in a safe bet show, that's the one that I would definitely end on.
Thank you for that. We shan't be talking about any bullets whatsoever, considering we're filming on the 18th of July. But amen to everything you've just said, ladies and gentlemen. It's an absolute pleasure to have Aaron GlynWilliams on the show. So thank you very much indeed, good sir. And thanks for listening. This has been the Safe Bet Show, its latest episode. My name is Martin Lycka, and I shall see you next time.